and welcome to Live Healthy, Live Well, West Virginia. I'm your host, Dr. Lisa Costello, a pediatric hospitalist and assistant professor of pediatrics at the West Virginia University School of Medicine. My guest today is Dr. Julia Daisy Frostino. Dr. Frostino is a risk and crisis communication scientist and an assistant professor of strategic communication at the West Virginia University Reed College of Media. She is also the founding director of the WVU Public Interest Communication Research Lab, or PIC Lab, the first of its kind lab in the nation. Dr. Frostino is joining us today to discuss health communication. Welcome to the show, Dr. Frostino.
Thank you, Dr. Costello. Thanks for having me.
So today, I wanted to have you on because in all the episodes that we do here, we talk at some form about how can you get health communication or reliable information. However, we've never really talked with our viewers about what does that mean. And I've had the privilege really to work with you on different projects, and I've learned so much about the field of social science. So we talked about how you're a communication scientist. I think social scientists are really in so many different aspects of the work we do in our community. And a lot of times they're behind the scenes helping others. And so maybe the public isn't aware of all the work that goes on with social scientists. So tell our viewers a little bit about what do social scientists, communication scientists do, and how does that then relate to healthcare or health-related information?
Sure, thanks. So communication scientists and social scientists, behavioral scientists, they do a lot of different varied work. In my area, I'm in communication in particular, and risk and crisis communication is my area. So that has to do with understanding the minds and hearts of people surrounding risks or crises or disasters to be able to deliver them communication that they want, that they need in order to make informed decisions to protect themselves, protect their families, and engage in their communities in the healthiest way possible. With regard to risk and crises, that can be in a variety of settings. When it comes to health in particular, that has to do with just understanding what people want and need, what their motivations are to make the behaviors that they do, what their barriers are to making those kinds of behaviors, and how can we craft communication strategically to enable them to be the best versions of themselves.
No, I think that's so important, and there's so many different areas, and we'll kind of get more into that because as a communication scientist, a social scientist, there's kind of this field that you've created a lab on. That was the first of its kind in the country here in West Virginia, the Public Interest Communication Research Lab. So talk to us a little bit about what is public interest communication, and maybe what is some of the work your lab does to try to help communities when it comes to health, but really a variety of issues.
Yeah, I would love to. So the Public Interest Communication Research Lab, we call it the PIC Lab. The PIC Lab at West Virginia University is, like, as you mentioned, the first of its kind in the nation to unite social and behavioral scientists toward positive social change through the power of communication. So in my lab, we have several faculty members and students and affiliates who work together to generally conduct research in 4 areas: community advocacy and engagement, risk and crisis communication, media sociology, and science communication. And our researchers use multiple methods that social and behavioral scientists use: quantitative methods like surveys or experiments, qualitative methods like focus groups, interviews, those kinds of things that really probe pressing social problems from multiple areas so that we can come at it from an interdisciplinary approach from people in varied backgrounds to craft communication that really meets the needs of folks in those areas. For us, it's in the public interest, and that's really important. So for public interest communication, that is the examining the development and the evaluation, implementation, evaluation of strategic communication efforts that extend beyond the needs of any single organization. So you might think of an organization as having a crisis, but really we're looking at public interest. We're centering the audiences, the people in the communities that are experiencing some kind of risk, such as a health risk or a disaster. And that can be anything from a flood to a pandemic, which we've experienced very recently, as we all know. So for me, I came at it originally from the flood space. So I could share a story with you if you'd like.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously many people in West Virginia have been impacted by
Yeah.
flooding, and that's like a crisis, which can have many impacts on our health. It can be stress related. So yeah, I think it's important because when we're in a crisis, we know we're having a stress reaction. So we may not be
Right.
able to consume all the information. Like maybe you were faced with a disaster, you had a loved one get faced with a tough diagnosis.
Yeah.
But so in an example of flooding, kind of talk about some of the work that you might do to help a community if they've been impacted by that.
Well, that's really how I came into public interest communication. So when my husband and I left, I'm originally from an area outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania. It's very much like many of the towns here in West Virginia, an old coal mining town near Scranton. And we had a little house there, and we both went on to try to create this bigger, brighter future for ourselves. I went on to try to get a PhD, and he went on to get his JD and become a lawyer. We were gonna, build this life together. And as we did that, we were about to try to rent out our house. I'll be honest, we weren't quite sure we were gonna make it. Not us together, us as professionals, are we gonna come back? So we thought, let's rent the house out and keep it, just in case we need to come back home. But then a really devastating flood hit our area, and my house was flooded and my whole community was flooded, and it was really devastating. And on the one side, I saw really a lot of miscommunication and misinformation coming in the town about what to build, how to rebuild, how best to protect yourself in floodwaters, what's in floodwaters, can you swim in floodwaters? The answer is no. It's not safe to swim in. But I also, on the flip side, saw a lot of community resilience, and I saw neighbors coming together. I saw generations-long parking feuds on my own street come to a halt as people tried to be there for each other. And so for me, when I saw kind of the juxtaposition between that lack or perceived lack of communication in the ways that people needed it from the government or local organizations versus the incredible heart communities have to look out for each other, I thought that's a space that I could do work in. I can help better unite people in these kinds of scenarios. I want to help governments and organizations meet people where they are and give them the information they want and need to be able to address these kinds of adverse events. And so that we don't have situations occur like did down the street from my home, where one of my neighbors wound up passing away from inhaling toxic fumes while trying to mitigate the flood damage in her home. So communication and science can help us gather data to understand what people want, what people think, what they need, what their motivations are, what their barriers are, so we can deliver them the communication that helps preserve lives and property, whether it's a flood, it's a pandemic, it could be vaccination communication, it can be about mobile radiation detectors. It's just about understanding people and meeting them where they are to give them what they need to make informed decisions.
Yeah, I think it's so powerful, and I've learned so much in my work as a physician and how I even communicate with patients, having had the opportunity to work with you, but also attend many of the different talks that you provide in regards to communication. And every time on this show, at some point with the expert, I come back and say, where can people find information? And always get that from our experts. And you are the communication expert. So we're going to kind of dive in a little bit more because this is definitely something I think the pandemic has brought to light, that there's so much information or communication, like you gave that example of the flood in your community. Well, in the pandemic, there was so much information coming from many different individuals. The World Health Organization has even called it an infodemic. So tell our viewers a little bit about what that is and how that kind of impacts our health.
Absolutely. I think we've all experienced that to some extent recently. The infodemic that the World Health Organization is talking about is when we are surrounded by so much information swirling around. Some of it's accurate, some of it isn't accurate, and trying to figure out how to sift the accurate information from the inaccurate information and what to trust, when to trust it, especially if the topic is evolving. So there's updates and new guidance and new information coming out. That's a very difficult path for all of us to navigate. And the infodemic is about just this information overload that we experience when we have the accurate information, the inaccurate information, and we're trying to figure out what decision to make for ourselves, for our families, for our neighbors. And that can be problematic.
Yeah, and I think that as you commented, there's so much changing information that comes. It can be really challenging. I mean, as we progress and learn more, things can change, and that can be really hard if you heard one thing and now somebody's saying something different. And you kind of touched on it a little bit in as we've been talking about this concept of misinformation, and then there's also this concept of disinformation. And I'll be honest, I didn't really appreciate them being different until really I've kind of gone more through my career and saw that. And as we have more access to information in a variety of different channels, that there is this misinformation and disinformation. So talk to our viewers a little bit about those, and are they the same? Because I don't know if I knew that there was a difference. So talk to us a little bit about that misinformation and disinformation.
I would love to. And there is a difference between disinformation and misinformation. And I think it's important for us to understand those differences because how we address them will vary based on the type of information that we're talking about. So they both have to do with inaccurate information. So this is information that's false. It's not true. With misinformation is inaccurate information that's shared unintentionally. The person who is sharing it with you thinks it's true, thinks it's real. They're sharing with you something they think you should know. They don't have any sinister motives. However, disinformation is a different story. Disinformation is information that is shared for more sinister reasons, intentionally. I'm telling you something that is inaccurate. I know it's inaccurate, and I want you to believe it. This can be thought of as being done for a few reasons. Honestly, it's mostly to either politicize, polarize, or monetize. Basically saying that the actors who are sharing disinformation have something to benefit from you believing it. So, for example, the Centers for Countering Digital Hate did a research study on social media that found that more than 65% of misinformation, so inaccurate information that people are sharing thinking it's true, actually originated from 12 individuals or organizations that they called the Disinformation Dozen. And these 12 organizations, individuals, they had something to benefit from sharing that misinformation. And this is specific to anti-vaccine information broadly. And a lot of times there can be organizations such as those that are profiting from wellness and home remedies types of products, and some of these are amazing, they're really wonderful. However, some of them have something to gain from people not believing in traditional science and only purchasing wellness types of products that they can take at home. So there's a monetary benefit to these types of bad actor organizations, different from the good actor organizations, sharing that kind of information. So misinformation shared with good intent, intending to share something they just don't realize it's false. Disinformation, intending to share information that is inaccurate because there's going to be something to gain from it.
No, I think that's very helpful. And you kind of touched on this a little bit. Sometimes you might end up sharing misinformation and not even realizing it because, sometimes it can be really believable, and I've seen it as, in a variety of media. I think probably most of us would think of social media, but there are even more, because someone could see something on social media and then have a conversation about it, and that would be another way of spreading that misinformation that, to your point, it might have started as disinformation, like someone purposely put something out there that they know is not accurate, but it can be really believable, can it be?
Oh, incredibly believable. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes it can even come from someone that you trust, that you love. They believe it, they see it, and it can look really professional, or it can come oftentimes in a storytelling kind of package. You know, you heard a story from your neighbor whose child at school heard from her friend that fill in the blank. That our brains are hardwired for storytelling. It's something that we absolutely hear. It sticks with us. It pulls on our emotions. We remember the information more. And that person that you hear this story from, this emotional story, they think it's real, even if it's someone you love or it's someone you know. And even if it's packaged in a story that seems like it's someone down the street, or it's something that's scary or loving or poignant in some way, all of that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. You know, and it can originate from a bad actor and then work its way through the best of actors, including those close to us, both looking like a story or looking like a professional, well done, well crafted piece of communication, whether it's something on social media like a graphic or an infographic, or it's a billboard, or it's a painted bus stand bench, or it's a pamphlet, you know, that look really well done. They can still be false. So it's really important to check on those sources and the original sources of info.
Let's dive a little bit more into that, because, you know, as we said, in the recent pandemic with so much information, I think that it's only getting harder because, as you said, it can really look professional or look that it's real, or you would read it and maybe you're in the busyness of a day. So what are some tips that people could use to try to ensure that the information they're receiving is accurate?
So a couple of the things that we just mentioned. So just because something looks professional doesn't mean that it's accurate or true. Sometimes quite the opposite. Also, look for those really emotional pulls. That can oftentimes be a red flag. Not always. Sometimes it's a genuine story. But looking at the original source of information, including facts, we tend to believe something if we see it in a number. But where did that number come from? What does it represent? And taking the time to check sources, check and double check. You know, you hear something, it sounds like it might be right. We have a tendency as humans to believe something if it aligns with our values, or, as you mentioned earlier on, during crises, risks, they come along with uncertainty. We want to fill that uncertainty. We have a drive to do it. You know, nobody likes sitting in uncertainty. So if we can get a resolution to something that seems uncertain and it fits our values and it's an answer, we're set up to believe it. You know, so checking those emotions that you might have, especially if it's about something uncertain, and going back to those trusted sources that that we know are sharing accurate information as much as possible, whether that's the CDC, it's the NIH, it's the FDA, it's the state health department. All of those kinds of sources are good kind of gut checks for those emotional stories or those highly polished, professional looking pieces of information that we maybe desperately want to believe but might not necessarily be true.
I think that's really important. And when it comes to health, there are so many different groups out there, and being able to identify, you know, I am part of different organizations from a medical perspective. So as a pediatrician, I'm a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics. There's other pediatric groups out there, and they all might have different viewpoints. The AAP has experts that they put forth guidelines that are then used in clinical practice. And it's really important to go and fact check, because there are people who will even try to mimic, whether it's the logo or the name, to then share information that's different. And so taking that time to go back and really check the source, and then as a physician myself, I've had people come and say, I did a Google search and this is what came up. And so I always try to go back and look and see, okay, well, where did you get that from? And then be able to use my experience and say, okay, this is what we know from different studies that have done, or this is what the guidelines, and this is what my clinical experience says. So having that discussion with your trusted healthcare professional is always important too, because it can definitely be overwhelming. You see all this information and you think that it's true. So you kind of mentioned, depending upon if it's misinformation or disinformation, that would kind of determine maybe the strategy that we would be able to use to address it. So is there anything that we can do to try to help address, this misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing more and more of?
Absolutely, there are some things that we can do. Sharing trusted, credible sources is always advisable, but I would say kind of picking and choosing where you're going to engage in these efforts. They can honestly be exhausting and difficult. But so if you're on social media, for example, and you see somebody who's presenting something inaccurate, but they're doing it in a kind of combative way, that might be one that you want to let go. So don't feed the trolls would be one piece. However, there's a lot of misinformation out there, as we were just talking about. People who are genuinely sharing something, they think that it's real, they think that it's true. And even if you don't change their mind within the conversation, there are lots of social media lurkers who are watching that conversation, and you sharing a piece of information in a really open and empathetic way where you're not repeating the misinformation. Don't repeat it, just present the factual, real information in a really kind and open way, with a source that's cited, that's credible. And that can be really helpful, even if it doesn't seem so on its face. The person you're discussing it with might not change their mind in the moment, but they might down the road. And even if they don't, the people who are listening and watching may. So engaging as you feel relevant and willing, and if you have the information, you can back it up with an external source, and doing that with empathy and trying to find shared values. We both care about our kids. I can tell you love your child. I do too. May I share something with you that I've heard about this from the CDC? That may be an approach you can take, where you connect on genuine shared values, provide the opportunity for the person to opt out if they need to or want to, and then give that trusted source.
No, I think those are some really great tips, because communication is all around us. I don't think people really appreciate, even if you just think in like the course of a day, you have TV, you have the internet, you have social media, emails, but also radio and billboards. And even, if you go to your doctor's office or to the local store, you might see some type of health communication out there. And so you consume all of this different information. So you kind of mentioned that a little bit of finding those credible sources, CDC, FDA. I think with some of on social media, you can sometimes even flag and ask if or I've seen that a little bit where they'll flag things to say, oh, that's like a newer feature to say, oh, this source has been seemed to not have accurate information. And so those are some of the means, but it might be harder if it's like on the radio, or if it's a TV or like a podcast, which is really popular these days. So what are your advice to our guests if they come across that and they come across this health communication? How could they kind of address that to make sure that it is as accurate as it could be?
Definitely engage in that double checking. So going to those trusted sources. Another thing that folks can do is, especially with these stories, you'll oftentimes hear these stories that are out there, and is this story true? Is this story not true? And there are fact checking resources out there that you can turn to see. For example, Snopes, SNOPES, they oftentimes will fact check. Factcheck.org is another website you can go to, and they'll oftentimes share, hey, you've been hearing this story out in the media or in your social circles. is it true? And they'll give you a rating on that and some background information that then you can use to share with folks in your circles who might be also finding those stories compelling, even if they wind up being misinformation.
No, I think that's really important because, again, we come across everything, you want to trust, but I think verifying that, and then I always recommend, have that conversation with a trusted healthcare professional that you may have in your life when it comes to health information. Because a lot of times, as you've pointed out when we've talked about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, people really might believe it themselves. They don't realize that it's not accurate. Maybe they didn't do that fact checking and they didn't do that double verification. And then all of a sudden they've shared something that's not true, and then it takes off. So I think it's really important to just take a step back and to do your homework, if you will, to ensure that that is accurate information and know that there's different resources out there to help. And there are people really addressing trying to have that good information, like you mentioned, when it comes to a crisis. There are different government groups, and when we're talking about the pandemic, state health department, local health departments, other different community trusted sources, really trying to share that accurate information so that people can get the information that they need. So in this whole span of public interest communication that you kind of work on, share with our viewers maybe an example of one of the different projects you've been involved with that's had a positive impact on being able to share that information that people need in that moment.
Sure. There are a variety of projects that are really wonderful, ranging, so outside of my lab, if you think even all the way back in the 80s, for example, some researchers at Harvard put together a major nationwide drunk driving campaign, but that's about the designated driver. So that would be an example of a public health driven campaign that's related to social behavioral science that really moves the needle on people's behavior. Once they created this term, designated driver, are you a DD? That enabled people to identify with that, to create a plan for making a DD when they went out. And they were able to collect qualitative and quantitative data that demonstrated that there were fewer people who tested as being intoxicated driving on the road after that campaign, and a substantial increase in folks who identified as being a DD. So that's just one example of how just creating a word and an idea for a concept that can drive people's behavior makes a big difference just in that communication outreach. As far as my lab is concerned, we do, one of the areas we work in is immunization communication. So we will often put together focus groups, interviews, surveys to understand what parents and guardians and the average everyday West Virginian across the state is thinking and feeling about whether they want to get a flu shot, or whether they'll choose the HPV vaccine for their child when they're of the relevant age, or if they would get a COVID-19 shot, right? So all of these kind of immunization discussions that people have and decisions that they need to make for themselves and their families. And what we find is that with quantitative research, qualitative research, again, those being the surveys, focus groups, interviews, we can really understand how people are feeling and thinking and craft communication that enables them to make that informed decision down to what questions they have and the answers we can provide them that are accurate and scientifically sound.
No, I think that's great advice. And I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Faustino, for joining us today and for all of your ongoing work to help people lead healthy lives by gaining clear, consistent, and scientifically sound information. Your work truly has saved countless lives here in West Virginia and beyond. Thank you for tuning in to Live Healthy, Live Well West Virginia on the Library Television Network.